What if having everything you ever wanted was the very thing that destroyed you? Imagine possessing extraordinary intelligence, unmatched wealth, international influence, fame beyond imagination, the respect of kings, the admiration of entire nations. Imagine becoming so successful that people traveled across continents simply to hear you speak. Imagine being remembered as the wisest person who ever lived. Most people believe that if they could reach that level of success, they would finally be happy, finally fulfilled, finally secure. Because modern society teaches us a simple equation: more success equals more satisfaction. More achievement equals more meaning. More possessions equal more peace. But what if that equation is wrong? What if a person could achieve everything the world offers and still lose the things that matter most? This is the story of Solomon, the king who inherited a kingdom unlike any the world had ever seen. The son of David, the builder of the temple, the author of wisdom literature that continues to influence humanity thousands of years later, the man who asked God not for riches or power, but for wisdom, and God gave him both. Scripture describes Solomon's wisdom as extraordinary. People came from distant lands seeking his counsel. He solved impossible disputes, composed thousands of proverbs, explored philosophy, studied nature, governed one of Israel's greatest periods of peace and prosperity. By every measurable standard, Solomon had succeeded. He had the career, the influence, the wealth, the intelligence, the opportunities, the legacy. If anyone should have lived a fulfilled life, surely it was Solomon. Yet hidden beneath the surface of this incredible success story lies one of the Bible's most heartbreaking tragedies. Because Solomon did not fail suddenly, he failed slowly. He did not abandon wisdom overnight. He drifted away from it, one compromise at a time, one rationalization at a time, one decision at a time. And perhaps that is what makes his story so terrifying. Most people imagine disaster arriving dramatically. A single catastrophic mistake, a sudden collapse, every But real life rarely works that way. Relationships rarely fall apart overnight. Character rarely disappears instantly. People rarely wake up one morning and decide to become someone they never intended to be. The greatest dangers often arrive quietly, through small choices that seem insignificant at the time. A little compromise, a little neglect, a little distraction, until eventually the person looking back in the mirror no longer recognizes who they have become. Solomon's story is not merely about wisdom. It is about the danger of believing wisdom alone is enough, because knowing what is right and doing what is right are not always the same thing. You can understand truth and still ignore it. You can give excellent advice while failing to follow it yourself. You can help others avoid mistakes while quietly making your own. And perhaps no biblical figure demonstrates this paradox more clearly than Solomon. The man who wrote, "Guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it," eventually stopped guarding his own. The man who warned others about temptation eventually surrendered to it. The man who taught that fearing God is the beginning of wisdom eventually allowed other influences to shape his heart. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Can intelligence become a substitute for character? Can success slowly blind us to our weaknesses? Can good people drift away from their deepest values without even realizing it? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if someone as wise as Solomon could lose his way, what does that mean for the rest of us? Because Solomon's greatest enemy was not ignorance. It was overconfidence. He knew God's commands. He understood the dangers. He recognized the importance of faithfulness. Yet, knowledge alone did not protect him. And maybe that is one of the most important lessons modern society desperately needs to hear. We live in an age overflowing with information. People have access to endless knowledge, books, podcasts, courses, videos, advice from experts. Never before has humanity possessed so much information. Yet, information has not automatically produced wisdom. People know the importance of healthy relationships. Yet families continue to break apart. People understand the dangers of greed. Yet ambition often becomes obsession. People recognize the value of integrity. Yet compromise remains common. The problem is rarely a lack of knowledge. The problem is learning how to live according to what we already know. Solomon understood this battle better than anyone, and yet he still lost it. That reality should humble us. Because Solomon was not evil. He was gifted. He was not foolish. He was brilliant. He was not faithless from the beginning. He loved God deeply. His downfall came through gradual compromise. And gradual compromise is dangerous precisely because it feels harmless. Nobody notices the first step. Nobody fears the small drift. Nobody imagines where the path eventually leads, until one day they wake up wondering how they ended up so far from who they once wanted to be. Perhaps that is why Solomon's story remains so relevant, because modern culture celebrates achievement while often neglecting character. It rewards performance while overlooking integrity. It admires success while ignoring the cost required to maintain it. Many people spend their entire lives climbing towards something. A career, recognition, security, influence, only to discover that reaching the top means very little if they lose themselves along the way. Solomon reached the top. He had everything people dream about, and yet the final chapters of his story reveal a painful truth. It is possible to gain the world and slowly lose what matters most. This is not simply the story of Israel's wisest king. It is the story of every person who has ever struggled between conviction and compromise, between success and significance, between knowing the right path and choosing to remain on it. This is the story of Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, the king who had everything, the man who discovered that wisdom without faithfulness can still lead to tragedy. And the question his life leaves behind may be one of the most important questions any of us will ever answer. What good is gaining everything you want if you lose yourself in the process? To understand Solomon, we must first understand the world he inherited. Because Solomon did not rise to power during chaos. He was not a revolutionary leader rescuing a nation from collapse. He was not a warrior king fighting for survival. Unlike many biblical figures who emerged from hardship, Solomon was born into privilege. He inherited success. He inherited stability. He inherited a kingdom that had already been built through someone else's struggles. And perhaps that is what makes his story so important. Because history often teaches us how people respond to suffering. Solomon teaches us how people respond to success. His story unfolds during what many historians and biblical scholars consider Israel's golden age, a period marked by unprecedented prosperity, political stability, international influence, economic expansion, and national peace. If David was the king who built the kingdom through battle, Solomon was the king who enjoyed the kingdom through peace. To appreciate this contrast, we must begin with David, Solomon's father. David had spent much of his life fighting, first against Goliath, then against Saul, then against Israel's enemies. His reign involved conflict, military campaigns, political crises, personal failures, and national challenges. David unified the tribes of Israel, established Jerusalem as the political and spiritual center of the nation, expanded territorial boundaries, strengthened military power, and laid the foundations for future prosperity. But those achievements came at a cost. David's life was filled with hardship. Victories were often won through sacrifice. Stability was achieved through struggle. By the time Solomon ascended the throne, much of that difficult work had already been completed. This distinction matters, because generations shaped by hardship often develop differently from generations raised in prosperity. People who struggle for survival frequently learn resilience, discipline, dependence, urgency. Those who inherit abundance face different challenges: comfort, complacency, entitlement, overconfidence. Neither environment guarantees success or failure, but each creates unique temptations. Solomon's story explores the dangers associated with abundance. When Solomon became king, Israel occupied a remarkable position. The kingdom had expanded significantly. Neighboring enemies had largely been subdued. Trade routes passed through Israel's territory. Political alliances strengthened national security. For perhaps the first time in Israel's history, peace became the dominant reality. This peace was extraordinary. For centuries, the ancient Near East had been characterized by constant warfare. Empires rose and fell through military conquest. Nations fought for territory, resources, and influence. Against this backdrop, Israel experienced something unusual: stability. Solomon's name itself reflects this reality. Derived from the Hebrew word related to shalom, meaning peace. His reign represented a transition from conflict to security, from survival to flourishing. And flourishing changed everything. The Bible describes Israel during Solomon's reign using vivid imagery. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea. People ate, drank, and were happy. Every man sat under his own vine and fig tree. These descriptions communicate more than prosperity. They communicate safety. People were not merely surviving, they were thriving. For ancient societies, this represented extraordinary success: food security, political stability, economic opportunity, national confidence. The conditions many civilizations spent centuries pursuing had finally arrived, and Solomon stood at the center of it all. Another defining feature of Solomon's era was economic expansion. Israel became deeply involved in international trade. Trade agreements connected Israel with neighboring kingdoms. Partnerships formed with powerful leaders such as Hiram, king of Tyre. Goods moved across vast distances: timber from Lebanon, gold from distant lands, precious materials from international markets. Solomon's administration oversaw complex economic systems that generated immense wealth. The Bible repeatedly emphasizes the extraordinary riches associated with his reign. Silver became so abundant that it was considered relatively common. Gold flowed into the kingdom. Luxury goods filled the royal court. The descriptions are striking. Ancient readers would have recognized Solomon's wealth as almost unimaginable. The kingdom reached levels of prosperity rarely experienced in Israel's history. Modern readers may struggle to grasp the significance. Today, wealth is often viewed individually: personal income, personal possessions, personal success. Ancient prosperity functioned differently. National wealth reflected political influence, security, prestige. A prosperous kingdom attracted international attention, and Solomon's kingdom attracted exactly that. Leaders from distant regions sought relationships with Israel. Foreign dignitaries visited Jerusalem. The most famous example appears in the account of the Queen of Sheba. According to Scripture, she traveled great distances to test Solomon's wisdom. Her response became legendary. She declared that the reports she had heard were incomplete. The reality exceeded the stories. This moment illustrates an important truth. Solomon's reputation extended far beyond Israel's borders. He became internationally recognized, not merely as a king, but as a symbol of wisdom and success. Imagine what that level of recognition would feel like. admiration from other nations, respect from powerful leaders, a kingdom flourishing under your leadership, a global reputation for intelligence and prosperity. Everything appeared to confirm that Solomon had become exactly the kind of king people dream about. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that success creates its own dangers. The greater the success, the greater the temptation to trust in success itself. Another extraordinary achievement of Solomon's reign involved construction. Perhaps nothing symbolizes his legacy more than the temple in Jerusalem. For generations, Israel had worshipped using the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary dating back to Moses. David had desired to build a permanent temple, but had been told that his son would complete the task. Solomon fulfilled that vision. The temple became one of the most significant religious structures in Israel's history. Built with extraordinary care and resources, it represented national identity, spiritual devotion, and covenant relationship with God. The dedication ceremony described in Scripture remains one of the most powerful moments in Solomon's life. He prayed publicly, acknowledged God's greatness, recognized human dependence upon divine mercy, and dedicated the nation to faithful worship. In this moment, Solomon appeared to embody wisdom at its finest: humility, leadership, devotion, purpose. It is important to remember this aspect of Solomon's story, because later failures often overshadow earlier faithfulness. Yet, Solomon genuinely began well. His desire for wisdom, his commitment to building the temple, his recognition of God's sovereignty. These realities were authentic. His story is tragic precisely because he possessed so much potential. Another fascinating dimension of Solomon's reign involved intellectual achievement. Scripture attributes thousands of proverbs and songs to him. He studied nature, animals, plants, human behavior, justice, leadership, relationships. His wisdom literature explored some of humanity's deepest questions. How should people live? What creates flourishing? What leads to destruction? How should power be used? How should relationships be managed? Solomon became not merely a political leader, but an intellectual figure, a thinker, a teacher, a philosopher. His influence extended beyond government into the realm of ideas. This combination of power and wisdom was rare. Many leaders possess authority without insight. Others possess insight without authority. Solomon appeared to possess both, which raises an important question. If someone with such extraordinary gifts could lose his way, what does that reveal about human nature? The answer begins emerging when we examine the psychological effects of prolonged success. Modern research consistently shows that success can alter perception. People receiving constant affirmation may become less receptive to criticism. Repeated victories can create overconfidence. Wealth can create illusions of self-sufficiency. Power can reduce accountability. These tendencies do not affect everyone equally, but they represent genuine risks. Success tests character differently than adversity. Adversity often exposes weakness. Success often conceals it. This may explain why Solomon's story remains so relevant. Most people understand the dangers of suffering. Fewer understand the dangers of prosperity. The golden age of Israel was extraordinary. Peace flourished. Wealth expanded. Influence increased. Wisdom was celebrated. The kingdom appeared stronger than ever before. From the outside, everything looked perfect. And perhaps that is precisely why the coming tragedy would be so devastating. Because Solomon's downfall did not occur during national crisis. It occurred during abundance, not during weakness. During strength, not during failure. During success. This reality challenges a common assumption. Many people believe that achieving certain goals will eliminate life's deeper struggles. If only they had enough money, enough recognition, enough influence, enough success. Then, fulfillment would finally arrive. Solomon's life suggests otherwise. External prosperity does not guarantee internal faithfulness. National success does not guarantee personal integrity. Wisdom does not automatically produce obedience. Israel's golden age became the stage upon which one of Scripture's most profound lessons would unfold. The lesson that having everything is not the same as becoming who you were meant to be. Solomon inherited peace, wealth, opportunity, influence, a kingdom at the height of its power. And yet the greatest battle of his life would not come from enemies outside the kingdom. It would emerge quietly from within his own heart. Because sometimes the greatest threats do not appear during hardship. Sometimes they appear when life seems to be going perfectly. And Solomon's story is about to show us exactly why. Who was Solomon? For many people, the answer seems obvious. He was the wisest man who ever lived. The king who built the temple, the author of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, the son of David. Yet beneath these familiar descriptions lies a much more fascinating story. Because Solomon was not simply born wise, he was a young man placed in an impossible position. A son living in the shadow of one of history's greatest kings. A leader inheriting a powerful nation at the height of its success. A man expected to preserve everything his father had fought to build. Before Solomon became a symbol of wisdom, he was simply a person facing enormous pressure. And perhaps that is where his story truly begins. Solomon was the son of King David and Bathsheba. Even this detail carries complexity. His parents' relationship emerged from one of the darkest chapters in David's life. Adultery, deception, the death of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah. The consequences that followed. Solomon's family history was marked by both grace and tragedy. He entered the world through a story that demonstrated humanity's capacity for failure and God's capacity for redemption. This background is significant because people often assume great leaders emerge from perfect circumstances. The Bible consistently tells a different story. Its heroes frequently come from broken families, complicated histories, unexpected situations. Solomon was no exception. His very existence reminded people that God could work through imperfect human stories. As David grew older, the question of succession became increasingly urgent. Who would inherit the throne? Who would lead Israel after David's death? The answer was not obvious. David had many sons. Several possessed political ambitions. One son in particular, Adonijah, attempted to seize power before David died. He gathered supporters, organized celebrations, positioned himself as the next king. From a political perspective, Adonijah appeared a likely candidate. Yet David intervened. Following earlier promises and divine guidance, he publicly declared Solomon as his successor. This decision changed history. Solomon was anointed king, placed upon David's mule, presented before the people, and recognized as Israel's future leader. Imagine the emotions Solomon may have experienced during this transition. Excitement, fear, uncertainty, responsibility. He was inheriting not merely a title but an entire nation, a kingdom unified through David's leadership, a people carrying enormous expectations. The son of Israel's greatest king now faced the challenge of becoming a king himself. Anyone in that position would feel pressure. Modern psychology recognizes that expectations profoundly shape human experience. Children of successful parents often struggle with comparison, the fear of inadequacy, the burden of maintaining family legacy, the anxiety of proving themselves. Solomon likely faced all of these realities. David had defeated giants, old armies, expanded the kingdom, written psalms that shaped Israel's worship. How does someone follow a figure like that? The question itself may explain much about Solomon's early decisions. Because when Scripture introduces Solomon as king, he appears remarkably aware of his limitations. This awareness becomes most evident in one of the most extraordinary moments of his life. Shortly after assuming the throne, Solomon traveled to Gibeon to offer sacrifices. There, according to the biblical account, God appeared to him in a dream. Then came an astonishing invitation. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Pause for a moment and consider the possibilities. Imagine receiving such an opportunity. Unlimited wealth, military power, political dominance, long life, personal success, victory over enemies. The options seem endless. Most people would likely choose security, comfort, control. The things they believe would guarantee happiness. Yet Solomon's response surprised everyone. Instead of asking for riches, he asked for wisdom. Specifically, he requested an understanding heart to govern God's people and distinguish between right and wrong. This request reveals something remarkable about Solomon's character at the beginning of his reign: humility. He recognized the magnitude of his responsibility. He understood that leadership required more than authority. He acknowledged that he lacked what the task demanded. Perhaps most importantly, he knew that power without wisdom was dangerous. This moment stands as one of the greatest examples of self-awareness in the Bible. Psychologists often emphasize the importance of recognizing one's limitations. People who overestimate their abilities frequently make poor decisions. Those who acknowledge uncertainty remain open to growth. Solomon initially belonged to the second category. He knew what he did not know. He understood that intelligence alone was insufficient. He needed wisdom. The distinction matters. Knowledge and wisdom are not the same thing. Knowledge involves information, facts, understanding. Wisdom involves application, judgment, discernment, the ability to know not only what is true, but what should be done. Modern society often celebrates knowledge, academic achievement, technical expertise, professional competence. Yet wisdom remains comparatively rare. People may understand principles while struggling to apply them. They may recognize truth while failing to live according to it. Solomon's request suggests he understood this difference. He did not merely want information. He wanted discernment, the ability to lead well. According to Scripture, God was pleased with Solomon's request because he had not asked for selfish gain, not wealth, not revenge, not personal advancement. He had asked for wisdom to serve others as we and every morning. God granted his request, but also promised additional blessings: riches, honor, influence. The story presents an important principle. Sometimes the pursuit of what truly matters leads to other benefits as well. Yet the priority remains crucial. Wisdom came first. This moment defines Solomon's early identity. He became known not primarily as a warrior or conqueror, but as a wise king. Stories of his discernment spread rapidly. The most famous example involves two women claiming the same child. Unable to determine the truth through ordinary means, Solomon proposed dividing the child between them. One woman agreed. The other begged that the child be given away rather than harmed. Solomon immediately recognized the true mother. The account demonstrates psychological insight rather than supernatural knowledge. He understood human nature. He recognized that genuine love prioritizes another person's well-being over personal possession. The story became legendary. People throughout Israel heard of Solomon's wisdom and respected him. His reputation expanded far beyond national borders. Yet this period of Solomon's life also reveals another important truth. Wisdom is not merely intellectual brilliance. It is moral clarity, the ability to see beyond appearances, to understand deeper realities. to prioritize justice, compassion, truth. This broader understanding of wisdom shaped Solomon's writings as well. The Book of Proverbs repeatedly emphasizes practical living, relationships, speech, work, money, discipline, humility, integrity. The wisdom Solomon pursued was deeply connected to everyday life. Not abstract philosophy detached from reality, but principles guiding human flourishing. He understood that small decisions shape character, that habits influence destiny, that values determine direction. These insights remain remarkably relevant today. Modern readers often approach wisdom as information, acquisition, books, podcasts, courses, advice. Yet Solomon reminds us that wisdom ultimately concerns how we live, not merely what we know. This distinction becomes increasingly important as his story progresses. Because Solomon eventually possessed extraordinary wisdom, yet possessing wisdom and obeying wisdom proved to be different challenges. This tension forms the heart of his tragedy. At the beginning, however, Solomon appeared to embody ideal leadership. He recognized his need, sought divine guidance, prioritized service over selfish ambition, exercised discernment, governed effectively. People admired him because he seemed to understand something many leaders miss. Leadership exists for the benefit of others, not merely for personal advancement. This perspective made Solomon exceptional. Perhaps that is why his later failures feel so painful, because readers witness not the downfall of a foolish man, but the gradual decline of a wise one. The difference matters. It is easier to dismiss foolish people, harder to understand wise people making destructive choices. Yet Solomon's life demonstrates an uncomfortable reality. Wisdom acquired does not automatically guarantee wisdom applied. A person can know the right path and still choose another. Knowledge alone cannot protect against compromise. Intelligence alone cannot prevent failure. Character requires continual cultivation. The king who asked for wisdom instead of power began remarkably well. He recognized his limitations, desired understanding, sought God's guidance. Few leaders in history have demonstrated such humility at the beginning of their reign. And perhaps that is why his story continues captivating readers, because it raises profound questions about human nature. Can wisdom be maintained? Can success coexist with humility? Can knowledge protect against temptation? What happens when a person who understands truth slowly stops living according to it? Before Solomon became the cautionary figure many remember, he was something else entirely. A young king overwhelmed by responsibility. A leader aware of his limitations. A man who asked for wisdom when he could have asked for anything else. And in that moment, he became exactly the kind of leader people long for. The tragedy is not that Solomon lacked wisdom. The tragedy is that even extraordinary wisdom must be guarded. Because asking for wisdom is only the beginning. Living according to it is the greater challenge. Most tragedies do not begin with rebellion. They begin with rationalization, a small compromise, a seemingly harmless decision, a choice that appears insignificant in the moment. Rarely do people wake up one morning and decide to abandon everything they once believed. The process is usually much slower, much quieter, almost invisible. One step, then another, until eventually they arrive somewhere they never intended to go. This is what makes Solomon's story so unsettling, because Solomon did not begin as a foolish king. He began as one of the wisest men who ever lived. He loved God. He sought wisdom. He built the temple. He governed successfully. He understood truth deeply. Yet somewhere along the way, wisdom stopped shaping his decisions, and compromise began taking its place. The Bible summarizes this transition with heartbreaking simplicity. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women, At first glance, this statement may seem surprisingly ordinary. After all, marriage itself is not inherently problematic. Love is not inherently dangerous. Relationships are a normal part of human life. Yet, in Solomon's case, something deeper was happening. These marriages were not merely personal decisions. They were political alliances. In the ancient world, kings frequently married daughters of neighboring rulers to secure peace treaties and strengthen diplomatic relationships. Marriage functioned as strategy, a tool of international politics. From a human perspective, Solomon's actions appeared intelligent, practical, effective. He was building stability, reducing conflict, strengthening his kingdom. This is what makes compromise so deceptive. It often appears reasonable. It rarely presents itself as obvious rebellion. Instead, it disguises itself as wisdom, efficiency, necessity, common sense. People convince themselves, this is different. It is not a big deal. He can handle it. Nothing bad will happen. Solomon may have thought the same way. After all, he was wise. Perhaps he believed he could maintain control. Perhaps he assumed his convictions were strong enough to withstand external influences. Perhaps he trusted his own judgment more than the warnings he had received. This is where the story becomes deeply psychological. One of the greatest dangers associated with intelligence is overconfidence. People who repeatedly make good decisions sometimes begin believing they are incapable of making bad ones. Success creates a sense of invulnerability. Repeated victories weaken caution. Wisdom itself can become a source of pride. Modern psychology refers to this phenomenon as overconfidence bias, the tendency to overestimate one's ability to manage risks, to assume that negative outcomes happen to other people, to believe that personal circumstances are exceptions to universal principles. Solomon may have fallen into this trap because the warnings were not hidden. Long before Solomon became king, Israel's leaders had received specific instructions concerning power. The book of Deuteronomy warned future kings against accumulating excessive wealth, excessive military power, and excessive wives. The concern was not arbitrary. These things had the potential to pull leaders away from dependence upon God, away from humility, away from faithfulness. The warning concerning marriage was especially clear. Foreign wives could turn the king's heart toward other gods. Solomon undoubtedly knew these instructions. He was a student of wisdom, a man deeply familiar with God's law. He did not lack information. He lacked obedience. And this distinction is crucial. Many people assume that knowledge automatically produces transformation. If someone knows what is right, surely they will do what is right. Reality repeatedly proves otherwise. People understand the importance of honesty and still lie. They recognize the value of healthy relationships and still neglect them. They understand the dangers of addiction and still pursue destructive habits. Knowledge informs. Character determines action. Solomon possessed extraordinary knowledge, yet knowledge alone could not protect him from gradual compromise. Notice how the process unfolds. The Bible does not describe Solomon rejecting God immediately. It does not describe sudden rebellion. Instead, it describes accumulation. More relationships, more alliances, more compromises. Eventually, Scripture records that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The numbers are staggering. Modern readers often struggle to comprehend them. Yet beyond the numbers lies a deeper truth. Compromise rarely remains isolated. Small compromises create conditions for larger ones. One exception becomes another, then another. Boundaries shift gradually. Values erode slowly, until eventually people justify actions they once would have rejected entirely. This progression appears repeatedly throughout human experience. A small ethical shortcut at work becomes acceptable, then a larger one. A minor dishonesty within a relationship becomes normalized. Then deeper betrayals follow. Personal habits once viewed as temporary become permanent patterns. Transformation rarely occurs overnight. Neither does destruction. Solomon's life illustrates this principle with painful clarity. The turning point was not one dramatic moment. It was the cumulative effect of many decisions. Yet eventually a specific consequence emerges. Scripture states, "His wives turned his heart after other gods." This sentence may be one of the saddest in the entire Bible, because it reveals that Solomon's greatest failure was not intellectual. It was relational. The wisest man who ever lived slowly gave his heart away. This observation highlights another important psychological truth. Human beings are profoundly shaped by relationships. The people closest to us influence our values, or priorities, or perspectives, or decisions. This influence is often subtle, almost invisible, yet remarkably powerful. Few people change their deepest convictions instantly. More often, those convictions shift gradually through repeated exposure to alternative ways of thinking. Modern research consistently supports this idea. Human behavior is strongly influenced by social environments, friendships, communities, family systems, cultural norms. People become increasingly similar to those surrounding them. Solomon's story reflects this reality. His relationships slowly redirected his affections, not because wisdom disappeared, but because wisdom stopped governing desire. This distinction matters enormously. People often assume the greatest threats come from ignorance. Sometimes they come from unmanaged desires. The question is not merely, what do I know? The deeper question is, what do I love? Because what people love eventually shapes how they live. Solomon loved wisdom, but apparently he also loved comfort, approval, political success, relationships that required compromise. Eventually, those competing loves created conflict, and compromise won. Perhaps this is why Proverbs repeatedly emphasizes guarding the heart, not merely guarding the mind, because the heart determines direction. The heart influences priorities. The heart shapes identity. Knowledge without disciplined affection becomes unstable. Solomon himself had warned others about this danger, yet somehow he failed to apply the lesson personally. This reveals another uncomfortable truth. Giving wise advice is easier than living wisely. Many people excel at helping others navigate difficulties. They offer insight, guidance, perspective, yet struggle to follow their own counsel. Objectivity becomes difficult when personal desires are involved. Solomon understood wisdom conceptually. The challenge came when wisdom required sacrifice, because conviction often demands saying no. No to opportunities. No to desires. No to relationships that compromise identity. No to short-term benefits that threaten long-term faithfulness. And saying no becomes especially difficult when people possess extraordinary success. Power creates options. Wealth removes constraints. Influence reduces accountability. Solomon experienced all three. Very few individuals in history possessed his combination of wisdom, prosperity, and authority. Yet rather than strengthening his convictions, these advantages gradually weakened them. Perhaps because external success often masks internal decline. People admire visible achievements. They cannot always see hidden compromises. Solomon remained successful outwardly. His kingdom flourished. His reputation endured. His accomplishments expanded. Meanwhile, something essential deteriorated internally. This pattern remains surprisingly modern. People can appear successful while quietly losing themselves. Careers advance while relationships deteriorate. Wealth increases while character weakens. Public admiration grows while private integrity erodes. The outside looks impressive. The inside tells a different story. Solomon's life warns against evaluating success solely through external measures, because true success involves alignment. values and actions, beliefs and behavior, convictions and choices. Once these become disconnected, trouble follows. The most tragic aspect of Solomon's turning point is that he likely never intended to abandon his convictions. Compromise rarely begins with malicious intent. It begins with confidence. The belief that limits are unnecessary, that exceptions are harmless, that self-control is sufficient, the belief that wisdom guarantees immunity. Solomon may have assumed he could manage influences that eventually managed him instead. This is why humility remains so essential. Humility acknowledges vulnerability. It recognizes that no one is beyond temptation. No one is beyond failure. No one graduates from the need for caution. The wisest people understand their capacity for weakness. The most dangerous moment often occurs when people believe failure is impossible. Solomon's story reminds us that no amount of intelligence can replace humility. No amount of knowledge can substitute for obedience. No amount of success eliminates the need for vigilance. The day Solomon chose compromise over conviction probably did not feel dramatic. No thunder, no crisis, no immediate consequences. Just another reasonable decision, another exception, another justification. Yet that ordinary choice began a process with extraordinary consequences. Because lives are rarely destroyed in a single moment. They drift, slowly, quietly, until eventually they reach destinations they never intended. Solomon's turning point was not the day he stopped being wise. It was the day he stopped allowing wisdom to govern his choices. And perhaps that is why his story remains so relevant. Because every person eventually faces the same question. Will conviction shape our compromises? Or will compromise reshape our convictions? Solomon answered that question, and history remembers the consequences. One of the greatest misconceptions in human history is the belief that intelligence automatically leads to wisdom. We assume that smart people make better choices, that highly educated individuals avoid destructive decisions. That knowledge naturally protects people from failure, but reality tells a very different story. Some of the most brilliant minds in history have destroyed their careers through arrogance. Some of the most talented leaders have ruined their families through poor choices. Some of the most educated people have become prisoners of addiction, greed, pride, or fear. And perhaps no biblical figure illustrates this paradox more clearly than Solomon, the man widely considered the wisest person who ever lived, the king whose insights shaped generations, the author of timeless wisdom literature. Yet also the man who slowly compromised the very principles he taught. How is this possible? How could someone so wise make such unwise decisions? The answer begins with understanding a crucial distinction. Intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. Intelligence is the ability to acquire knowledge, to analyze information, to recognize patterns, to solve problems. Wisdom is the ability to apply truth correctly, to make sound judgments, to align decisions with values, to understand not merely what can be done, but what should be done. Intelligence asks, what is possible? Wisdom asks, what is right? Intelligence builds nuclear technology. Wisdom determines whether it should be used. Intelligence creates social media algorithms. Wisdom considers how they affect human relationships. Intelligence accumulates wealth. Wisdom determines how wealth should be managed. The world desperately needs both. But without wisdom, intelligence can become dangerous. History provides countless examples. Brilliant financial experts creating systems built on greed. Talented scientists using discoveries for destruction. Gifted politicians manipulating truth for power. Highly educated individuals making catastrophically poor moral decisions. Knowledge expanded. Character did not. Solomon understood this difference better than most. In Proverbs, he repeatedly distinguished between knowledge and wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Notice what he did not say. He did not say that education is the beginning of wisdom, or intelligence, or experience. He identified humility, the recognition that human understanding has limits. This insight is psychologically profound. Modern psychology increasingly recognizes that intellectual ability alone does not guarantee emotional maturity or ethical decision-making. Researchers speak about emotional intelligence, self-awareness, impulse control, empathy, character strengths, all qualities related to wisdom rather than raw intelligence. A person may possess an exceptional IQ while lacking emotional regulation. They may solve complex mathematical problems yet struggle with relationships. They may excel professionally while failing personally. Solomon appears to have experienced exactly this contradiction. He possessed extraordinary intellectual gifts. He understood leadership, justice, human behavior, relationships. He wrote extensively about discipline and self-control. Yet understanding something intellectually is different from embodying it personally. Psychologists often refer to this phenomenon as the knowing-doing gap. People frequently know what they should do. The challenge lies in actually doing it. Most people understand the importance of exercise, yet many avoid it. Most understand the value of healthy communication, yet conflict persists. Most know that excessive stress damages health, yet lifestyles remain unchanged. Information rarely transforms behavior by itself. Transformation requires something deeper: habit, discipline, humility, accountability, character. Solomon possessed knowledge, but gradually, character stopped supporting knowledge. Another fascinating psychological principle relevant to Solomon's story is called cognitive dissonance, the discomfort experienced when actions conflict with beliefs. When people behave inconsistently with their values, they experience internal tension. To reduce this discomfort, they often choose one of two paths: change behavior or change justification. Unfortunately, many choose justification. They rationalize. This situation is different. I deserve this. No one will be hurt. It is only temporary. Over time, these justifications allow people to maintain a positive self-image while engaging in behaviors they once considered unacceptable. Perhaps Solomon experienced this process. After all, his compromises were gradual. He did not reject wisdom overnight. He adjusted it, modified it, made exceptions, until eventually the gap between what he taught and how he lived became enormous. This reveals another important truth. Wisdom requires integrity. Integrity means wholeness, alignment, consistency between belief and behavior. Without integrity, intelligence becomes fragmented. People know one thing, say another, do something else entirely. The result is internal division. Modern society often rewards intelligence while neglecting integrity. Schools emphasize academic achievement. Businesses prioritize performance. Cultures celebrate innovation. Yet wisdom receives less attention. Who a person becomes matters just as much as what a person accomplishes, perhaps even more. Another psychological danger associated with intelligence is overconfidence. The smarter people become, the easier it can be to trust their own judgment excessively. Success reinforces this tendency. Repeated victories create confidence. Confidence becomes certainty. Certainty becomes pride. Pride reduces openness to correction. Modern research has identified something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with limited competence often overestimate their abilities. Yet there is another danger rarely discussed. Experts sometimes overestimate their immunity to mistakes precisely because they possess genuine expertise. Solomon may have fallen into this trap. He had solved difficult problems, governed effectively, earned international admiration. His wisdom had been validated repeatedly. Perhaps he began believing he could handle situations others could not. Perhaps he assumed he was strong enough to manage influences that would overwhelm ordinary people. Pride rarely announces itself openly. It whispers, "You know better. You can handle this. The rules apply to others. You are different." Few people intentionally become arrogant. More often, confidence slowly evolves into self-reliance. Self-reliance becomes independence. Independence becomes isolation from accountability. And isolated people become vulnerable. Another difference between intelligence and wisdom involves time perspective. Intelligence often focuses on immediate solutions. Wisdom considers long-term consequences. Intelligence asks, "Will this work?" Wisdom asks, "What happens next?" This distinction appears repeatedly in Proverbs. Solomon warned against impulsiveness, against shortcuts, against decisions producing temporary rewards but long-term pain. He understood delayed consequences. Ironically, he later ignored many of his own insights. This highlights an uncomfortable reality. People often teach lessons they personally struggle to apply. The counselor battling private pain, the doctor neglecting personal health, the financial advisor struggling with debt, the relationship expert facing family difficulties. Human beings are complex. Knowledge does not eliminate vulnerability. Wisdom requires continuous practice. There is also a significant emotional component to wisdom. Emotions themselves are not enemies. Fear protects. Love connects. Anger highlights injustice. Joy enriches life. Problems arise when emotions dominate decision-making without guidance from values. Intelligence alone struggles to manage emotional complexity. Wisdom integrates emotion with principle. Solomon's story suggests that emotional attachments eventually influenced him more than intellectual convictions. His relationships affected his decisions. His desires reshaped priorities. His affections redirected his loyalty. This demonstrates another profound truth. People do not merely think their way through life. They love their way through life. What people desire often shapes decisions more powerfully than what people know. This is why wisdom involves not only educating the mind, but forming the heart. The modern world often assumes information solves human problems. If people know enough, they will live differently. Yet history repeatedly disproves this assumption. Never before has humanity possessed so much information. Yet anxiety persists. Division persists. Addiction persists. Loneliness persists. The issue is rarely a lack of information. The issue is transformation. How do people become the kind of individuals who consistently choose what is good? Solomon's life suggests that wisdom requires more than intelligence. It requires humility, character, accountability, discipline, alignment between values and actions. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that no one becomes too wise to fail. This may be Solomon's greatest psychological lesson. Vulnerability never disappears. No amount of knowledge eliminates the need for vigilance. No level of success removes the necessity of humility. No degree of intelligence guarantees good decisions. Wisdom is not a destination. It is a practice, a daily choice, a continual commitment to living according to truth. Perhaps that is why the final chapters of Solomon's life feel so tragic. Not because he lacked wisdom, but because he stopped allowing wisdom to shape his choices. The wisest man who ever lived reminds us of something every generation needs to hear. Being smart is not enough. Understanding truth is not enough. Even teaching truth is not enough. The real challenge lies elsewhere. Will we live according to what we already know? Because intelligence may help people succeed, but wisdom helps people become whole. And in the end, becoming whole matters far more than simply appearing brilliant. Few figures in the Bible create as much tension and contradiction as Solomon. Ask one group of people who Solomon was, and they will describe him as the greatest example of wisdom in human history. Ask another group, and they will see him as one of Scripture's most tragic warnings. Both groups point to the same man, the king who built God's temple, the king who asked for wisdom instead of wealth, the king who authored Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, the king whose fame spread throughout the ancient world, yet also the king who ignored clear warnings, the king whose heart drifted away from God, the king whose compromises contributed to the eventual division of Israel. So, which interpretation is correct? Was Solomon a model of wisdom, or a warning about success without self-discipline? The answer is not simple. And perhaps that complexity is exactly why Solomon remains one of the most fascinating figures in biblical history, because his story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Human beings are capable of extraordinary greatness and profound failure at the same time. When most people think about wisdom, they imagine perfection, someone who always makes the right decisions, someone immune to temptation, someone who consistently applies truth without contradiction. But Solomon challenges that assumption. He reminds us that wisdom is not the absence of weakness. Knowledge does not eliminate vulnerability. Intelligence does not remove human frailty. The controversy surrounding Solomon begins with his incredible achievements. Objectively speaking, his reign represented Israel's golden age. The nation experienced peace. Economic prosperity expanded dramatically. International influence increased. The temple was built. The justice system functioned effectively. The kingdom reached heights never seen before or after. These accomplishments cannot be ignored. Furthermore, Solomon's writings continue influencing millions of people thousands of years later. Proverbs offers practical wisdom about relationships, discipline, integrity, work ethic, speech, and decision-making. Ecclesiastes explores profound questions about meaning, mortality, purpose, and the limitations of worldly success. Song of Songs celebrates love and intimacy. The intellectual and spiritual legacy Solomon left behind remains extraordinary. Supporters of Solomon's positive legacy argue that these achievements matter deeply. After all, no leader is perfect. Every biblical hero possesses flaws. Abraham struggled with fear. Moses struggled with anger. David committed serious moral failures. Peter denied Jesus. Yet their failures do not erase their faithfulness. Perhaps Solomon should be understood similarly. As a deeply flawed but genuinely wise man whose contributions outweigh his mistakes. This perspective emphasizes grace, the reality that God works through imperfect people. It also reflects historical reality. Very few leaders maintain flawless records over long careers. Human complexity makes simple categories difficult. Perhaps Solomon belongs among those whose lives contain both triumph and tragedy. Yet others argue that Solomon's failures were too significant to minimize. His downfall was not merely personal. It had national consequences. Scripture explicitly connects Solomon's compromises with Israel's future division. His choices influenced generations. This perspective views Solomon primarily as a cautionary example, not because his wisdom was false, but because he failed to live according to it. The warning becomes especially powerful because Solomon knew better. His problem was not ignorance. He understood God's commands. He understood the dangers of compromise. He had written extensively about self-control. Yet he ignored his own advice. This distinction matters enormously. There is a profound difference between making mistakes through ignorance and making them despite understanding the truth. The second category often reveals deeper issues, not intellectual deficiency, but failures of character and discipline. This is where the controversy becomes psychologically fascinating. Can someone genuinely be wise if they consistently violate their own principles? Modern society wrestles with similar questions. Can a brilliant scientist who behaves unethically still be considered wise? Can a successful business leader who destroys personal relationships still represent wisdom? Can a gifted teacher who fails to practice what they preach remain an example worth following? People disagree. Some separate accomplishment from character. Others insist that true wisdom requires integrity. Solomon forces us into this debate because he excelled intellectually while struggling personally. Another perspective suggests that Solomon's story intentionally combines both interpretations. Perhaps he is meant to be both model and warning, and example of wisdom's value, and a warning about wisdom's limitations when disconnected from self-discipline. This interpretation may best capture the complexity of his life. After all, Solomon's early choices deserve admiration. His humility in requesting wisdom, his desire to serve his people effectively, his commitment to building the temple, his pursuit of justice. These qualities reflect genuine wisdom, yet his later compromises reveal another truth. Wisdom acquired must continually be practiced. Character requires maintenance. Discipline requires persistence. Success creates new vulnerabilities. Perhaps Solomon demonstrates that wisdom is not a permanent achievement. It is an ongoing pursuit. Modern psychology offers fascinating insights into this discussion. Researchers consistently observe that self-control predicts life outcomes more effectively than intelligence alone. Academic ability matters. Talent matters. Opportunity matters. Yet the ability to regulate impulses, delay gratification, maintain discipline, and align behavior with values often proves equally important. This principle appears throughout Solomon's story. His intelligence was extraordinary. His self-discipline gradually weakened. Eventually, intelligence alone could not compensate. The lesson is striking. Knowing what is right does not guarantee doing what is right. Many people possess sufficient knowledge to improve their lives. They understand healthy habits, financial responsibility, communication skills, ethical principles. Yet applying these consistently remains challenging. The gap between knowledge and action is one of humanity's oldest struggles. Solomon may represent its most famous example. Another important aspect of this controversy involves the nature of success itself. Modern culture often celebrates achievement without examining its cost. Power, wealth, influence, recognition. These become markers of accomplishment. Yet Solomon's story raises an essential question. What happens if success outpaces character? A person may achieve extraordinary things professionally while experiencing personal collapse. Public admiration can coexist with private dysfunction. External success can mask internal decline. Solomon's life illustrates this possibility with painful clarity. He gained almost everything society admires, yet slowly lost what mattered most. This reality challenges common assumptions. People often believe that reaching certain goals will resolve deeper struggles. If only they had enough money, enough influence, enough success, then fulfillment would follow. Solomon's experience suggests otherwise. External achievements cannot substitute for internal integrity. The controversy becomes even more profound when considering Ecclesiastes. Many scholars believe Solomon wrote this book later in life. If so, Ecclesiastes reads almost like a reflection from someone looking back with painful honesty. Again and again, the author describes worldly pursuits as meaningless. Pleasure, wealth, achievement, knowledge, success. None provided lasting fulfillment. Some interpret Ecclesiastes as evidence of repentance, a wise man recognizing his mistakes, returning to essential truths. Others see it as the reflections of someone deeply aware of life's complexities. Either way, the book adds another dimension to Solomon's legacy. Perhaps his failures themselves became sources of wisdom. Painful teachers, harsh instructors, evidence that even great success cannot satisfy deeper spiritual needs. This possibility changes how we understand him. Rather than viewing Solomon as either hero or failure, perhaps he becomes something more human. A gifted individual navigating extraordinary opportunities and profound weaknesses. A man capable of both brilliance and compromise. Someone whose life reflects humanity's ongoing struggle between conviction and temptation. This interpretation resonates because it feels familiar. Most people do not fit neatly into categories of hero or villain. They possess strengths and weaknesses, moments of courage and moments of failure, consistency and contradiction. Solomon magnifies these realities on a grand scale. The wisest king, the compromised leader, the truth teller, the rationalizer, the faithful worshiper, the man who drifted, all existing within the same person. Perhaps this complexity explains why his story remains so relevant. People recognize themselves in it. The parent giving wise advice while struggling personally, the leader succeeding publicly while fighting private battles, the professional excelling in one area while neglecting another, the individual who knows better but still falls short. Solomon reminds us that wisdom does not remove humanity. It must be continually chosen, continually practiced, continually protected. So was Solomon a model of wisdom. Yes, his insights continue guiding millions. His pursuit of understanding remains admirable. His early humility offers an extraordinary example. Was Solomon also a warning about success without self-discipline? Absolutely. His compromises reveal the dangers of neglecting character. His failures demonstrate that intelligence alone cannot protect against temptation. Perhaps the controversy itself contains the lesson. Human beings do not need simplistic heroes. They need honest examples. Examples demonstrating both possibility and caution. In Solomon, we see both. The heights wisdom can achieve, and the consequences of abandoning it. Maybe the most important question is not whether Solomon was a model or a warning. Perhaps the real question is, which part of Solomon's story will we choose to follow? The young king asking for wisdom. The older king assuming wisdom made him immune to failure. Because Solomon's life teaches one undeniable truth. Success without self-discipline is dangerous. But wisdom combined with humility remains one of humanity's greatest strengths. And the choice between those paths confronts every generation, including our own. What if Solomon lived today? Not as a king seated upon a golden throne in ancient Jerusalem, not as the ruler of Israel's greatest empire, but as a leader in the 21st century, in a world of artificial intelligence, social media, global markets, instant communication, unlimited entertainment, and unprecedented access to information. Would Solomon still become known as the wisest man alive? Or would he become another cautionary tale about intelligence without discipline? Perhaps more. Importantly, what would Solomon think about a world where people have access to more knowledge than any generation in history, yet often struggle to find meaning? The question feels increasingly relevant, because in many ways, modern society resembles Solomon's world more than we might realize. His age was marked by prosperity, expansion, innovation, international influence, cultural exchange, material abundance. Our world shares many of these characteristics. Technology has transformed daily life. Economic opportunities have expanded. Information flows continuously. Human achievement continues accelerating. Yet alongside this progress, anxiety remains widespread. Loneliness persists. Burnout increases. People continue asking ancient questions. Why am I here? What actually matters? Will success make me happy? How much is enough? Perhaps Solomon would understand these questions better than anyone, After all, he spent much of his life pursuing answers to them. Imagine Solomon today. He would likely be celebrated as a genius, perhaps a visionary entrepreneur, a renowned author, a global thought leader, a highly respected advisor to governments and corporations. His insights into human behavior, leadership, economics, and relationships would attract enormous attention. People would invite him onto podcasts. Universities would seek his lectures. Millions would consume his content online. His wisdom, literature might dominate bestseller lists. Yet beneath the admiration, another challenge would emerge. Modern society rewards expertise, but it often confuses expertise with wisdom. Knowledge and wisdom are not identical, and perhaps nowhere is that distinction more important than in today's information age. Never before have people possessed such extraordinary access to information. A smartphone provides immediate access to history, science, psychology, philosophy, finance, medicine, education. People can learn almost anything within seconds. The amount of knowledge available today would have seemed unimaginable throughout most of human history. Yet, despite this abundance of information, many people remain uncertain about how to live. Knowledge has expanded. Wisdom has not necessarily kept pace. This creates what some psychologists call information overload. The human mind evolved within environments containing limited information. Today, people process hundreds of messages daily. Emails, news updates, social media posts, advertisements, videos, notifications, opinions, advice from strangers, conflicting perspectives. The result is often confusion rather than clarity. People know more, yet struggle to decide. They understand multiple viewpoints, yet feel uncertain about which values should guide their lives. Perhaps Solomon would recognize this problem immediately, because his writings repeatedly emphasize discernment, the ability to distinguish between what is merely available and what is truly valuable. Modern culture often encourages accumulation. More information, more experiences, more possessions, more opportunities. Yet Solomon eventually concluded that accumulation alone could not satisfy the human soul. This insight appears most clearly in Ecclesiastes. After pursuing knowledge, pleasure, wealth, achievement, and influence, Solomon repeatedly described these pursuits as meaningless, not because they lacked any value, but because they could not ultimately provide lasting fulfillment. Imagine Solomon observing contemporary consumer culture. He would likely notice a familiar pattern. People pursuing success with extraordinary intensity, careers consuming identity, productivity becoming self-worth, achievement becoming purpose. The assumption underlying these pursuits often remains unspoken. If I accomplish enough, I will finally feel fulfilled. If I earn enough, I will finally feel secure. If I become successful enough, I will finally be happy. Solomon spent much of his life testing these assumptions. He possessed extraordinary wealth. Scripture describes his riches in astonishing terms. Gold flowed into his kingdom. Luxury surrounded him. Resources appeared limitless. If financial success guaranteed fulfillment, Solomon should have become history's happiest man. Yet Ecclesiastes suggests otherwise. Material abundance satisfied certain desires, but not deeper longings. This distinction remains profoundly relevant. Modern psychology increasingly supports a similar conclusion. Research consistently shows that once basic needs are met, additional wealth produces diminishing returns regarding happiness. Money improves comfort, security, opportunities, but it struggles to provide meaning, purpose, connection, identity. People often expect external achievements to solve internal questions. Solomon discovered that they cannot. Another modern parallel involves the pursuit of experiences. Contemporary culture frequently encourages people to maximize enjoyment. Travel more, Consume more entertainment. Seek more excitement. Avoid boredom at all costs. Pleasure itself is not inherently problematic. The issue emerges when pleasure becomes life's primary objective. Solomon explored this path extensively. He pursued entertainment, luxury, personal satisfaction, yet eventually concluded that pleasure alone could not sustain meaning. This observation challenges modern assumptions. Many people organize life around comfort and enjoyment, yet comfort rarely produces purpose. Purpose often emerges through responsibility, contribution, relationship, sacrifice. Solomon's reflections suggest that human beings require more than stimulation. They require significance. Perhaps the greatest challenge Solomon would face today involves distraction. Ancient kings managed political pressures. Modern individuals manage constant digital interruptions. Attention has become one of the most valuable commodities in contemporary society. Companies compete aggressively to capture it. Algorithms are designed to maintain engagement. Endless content ensures that silence becomes increasingly rare. Yet wisdom requires reflection. Discernment requires stillness. Purpose requires intentionality. The constant fragmentation of attention makes these increasingly difficult. Imagine Solomon scrolling through social media. He would likely observe people comparing themselves continuously, measuring worth through visibility, seeking validation through public approval, curating identities rather than cultivating character. This phenomenon aligns closely with concerns raised throughout Proverbs: the dangers of pride, the pursuit of appearances, the temptation to value external recognition more than internal integrity. Modern technology amplifies ancient human tendencies. The underlying struggles remain unchanged. Another issue Solomon might address involves the crisis of meaning affecting many contemporary societies. Despite unprecedented prosperity, increasing numbers of people report feelings of emptiness, anxiety, isolation, lack of direction. Some researchers describe this as an existential vacuum, the experience of possessing freedom without purpose, options without guidance, opportunities without meaning. Solomon's life speaks directly into this condition, because he explored nearly every avenue modern people often pursue: knowledge, success, pleasure, achievement, influence, and eventually concluded that none could independently provide ultimate meaning. This conclusion does not imply these pursuits lack value. Rather, it suggests they function best when integrated into a larger framework of purpose. Solomon ultimately pointed towards something beyond temporary accomplishments: relationship with God, reverence, humility, recognition of human limitations. His famous conclusion in Ecclesiastes summarizes this perspective: fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of mankind. Modern readers may interpret this statement differently depending upon their worldview. Yet psychologically, the principle remains powerful. Human beings flourish when connected to purposes greater than themselves. Whether expressed through faith, service, community, or transcendent values, meaning often emerges through commitment to something beyond personal gratification. If Solomon lived today, he might challenge both extremes of contemporary culture. He would likely question materialism, the belief that possessions create fulfillment. But he might also question anti-intellectualism, the rejection of knowledge and expertise. Solomon valued understanding deeply. He celebrated learning, curiosity, insight. The problem was never knowledge itself. The problem was expecting knowledge alone to satisfy the soul. He would likely encourage integration, knowledge guided by wisdom, success grounded in purpose, achievement balanced by humility, technology serving human flourishing rather than replacing it. Perhaps Solomon's greatest message to modern society would concern limits. Contemporary culture often resists limitation. People want unlimited choices, unlimited freedom, unlimited growth, unlimited success. Yet Solomon's experience suggests that boundaries protect what matters most. Without limits, desires expand endlessly. Expectations escalate continuously. Contentment becomes elusive. Self-discipline emerges as essential, not because pleasure is evil, but because unrestrained desire eventually consumes itself. This lesson feels increasingly urgent. Modern societies possess extraordinary capabilities. Yet capabilities require guidance. Intelligence requires wisdom. Power requires responsibility. Freedom requires discipline. Solomon understood these realities intimately, because he experienced both extraordinary success and painful consequences. If Solomon lived today, he might not tell people to pursue less knowledge. He would probably encourage deeper wisdom, not less ambition, but healthier ambition, not rejection of success, but redefining success. Perhaps he would ask questions many people avoid. What is all this achievement for? What kind of person are you becoming? Are your accomplishments serving your values or replacing them? Are you using success wisely or allowing success to shape you? These questions remain uncomfortable because they challenge cultural assumptions. Yet Solomon's life suggests they are necessary, because a world overflowing with information still desperately needs wisdom. A society pursuing abundance still requires meaning, and individuals achieving extraordinary things still need purpose. Solomon understood both the possibilities and limitations of human success. He reached heights few people ever experience, yet discovered that even extraordinary accomplishments cannot answer life's deepest questions. Perhaps that is why his story continues resonating today. Not because modern people lack opportunities, but because they continue searching for significance within them. And Solomon's life offers both encouragement and warning. Success is not wrong. Knowledge is not dangerous. Achievement is not meaningless. But none of these things can replace the deeper work of becoming wise. Because in an age of excess, the greatest challenge is not obtaining more. It is learning what truly matters. And Solomon spent his entire life discovering just how important that distinction really is. If Solomon's life could be summarized in one painful sentence, it might be this: knowing what is right is not the same as choosing to live it. This is the tragedy that echoes through his story. Not ignorance, not lack of opportunity, not lack of wisdom, but the gap between understanding truth and practicing truth. Because Solomon knew the commandments of God. He knew the dangers of compromise. He knew the importance of humility. He knew that the human heart could be led astray. He knew that wealth could become an idol. He knew that power could corrupt. He knew that desires left unchecked could reshape a person's character. He taught these principles to others. He wrote about them. He advised people to live by them. Yet somehow, somewhere along the journey, he stopped applying them to himself. And perhaps that is why Solomon's story is one of the most important stories in the entire Bible. Because most people do not fail because they lack knowledge. They fail because they fail to live according to what they already know. This truth is uncomfortable because it removes many of our favorite excuses. We often tell ourselves, if I knew more, I would do better. If I had better advice, I would make wiser choices. If I understood the situation more clearly, I would change. Sometimes those statements are true. Information matters. Education matters. Wisdom matters. But eventually, every person reaches a point where knowledge alone is no longer the issue. The issue becomes action. Will I live according to what I already know? Modern society has more access to knowledge than any generation in history. People understand the importance of healthy relationships, yet many neglect the people they love most. People know that constant stress damages mental and physical health, yet continue living unsustainable lifestyles. People understand the dangers of dishonesty, yet still choose shortcuts. People know that comparison steals joy, yet continue measuring themselves against others. People know that time is limited, yet spend years distracted by things that matter very little. The problem is rarely a lack of information. The problem is often a lack of alignment, the distance between belief and behavior. This gap appears everywhere, in workplaces, in families, in governments, in religious communities, and perhaps most importantly, within ourselves, because human beings possess an extraordinary ability to recognize truth while resisting it simultaneously. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the discomfort experienced when actions conflict with beliefs, when people know one thing but do another. Most individuals respond to this tension in one of two ways. They change their behavior. They justify it. Unfortunately, justification often feels easier. People tell themselves, "It is only temporary. This situation is different. Everyone else does it. I deserve this. I will change later." Small rationalizations become habits. Habits become patterns. Patterns become identity. And eventually people find themselves living lives they never intended to create. Solomon's story follows this exact progression. He did not reject wisdom overnight. He compromised gradually. He did not stop believing truth. He stopped practicing it consistently. The danger of this process is that it often feels harmless. Most people imagine that life-changing failures arrive dramatically. They expect warning signs to be obvious. They assume major mistakes will feel dangerous. But often they do not. Small compromises rarely feel significant. Skipping one important conversation, ignoring one boundary, choosing convenience over conviction once. Each decision appears manageable in isolation. Yet life is shaped less by isolated moments and more by repeated choices. Character forms through consistency, both positive and negative. Solomon understood this intellectually. Proverbs repeatedly emphasizes the power of small decisions, the importance of discipline, the value of self-control, the necessity of guarding one's heart. Ironically, the man who taught these principles struggled to embody them completely. This reality should not merely discourage us, it should humble us, because Solomon's failure reveals something universal about human nature. No amount of intelligence eliminates the need for intentional living. No amount of wisdom removes the necessity of discipline. No amount of spiritual insight guarantees obedience. People do not drift toward what matters most. They drift away from it. Healthy relationships require effort. Integrity requires effort. Purpose requires effort. Faithfulness requires effort. Without intentional choices, distraction becomes easier than focus. Comfort becomes easier than growth. Compromise becomes easier than conviction. Solomon's life reminds us that wisdom must be practiced daily. Another important lesson emerges when we consider the difference between admiration and transformation. Many people admire good values: honesty, compassion, courage, humility, discipline, integrity. Yet admiration alone changes nothing. A person can appreciate healthy habits without developing them, respect honesty without becoming honest, celebrate courage without acting courageously. Transformation requires participation, not merely appreciation. Modern culture often confuses inspiration with change. People listen to motivational speeches, read self-improvement books, watch educational content, feel inspired, then return to old habits. Because information creates awareness, action creates transformation. Solomon had extraordinary awareness. The challenge came in sustaining action. This distinction matters enormously, because true wisdom is not measured by what people know. It is measured by how people live. Imagine two individuals. One possesses remarkable knowledge but consistently ignores it. The other possesses modest understanding, but faithfully applies what they know. Which person demonstrates greater wisdom? Most people intuitively recognize the answer. Wisdom is practical. It shapes decisions, relationships, priorities, behavior. Without application, knowledge remains incomplete. Perhaps this explains why Jesus later emphasized obedience so strongly. Hearing truth without practicing it creates instability. Knowledge without action produces illusion. People begin assuming they are becoming wise simply because they understand wise ideas. Solomon's story warns against this deception. Understanding principles is only the beginning. Living according to them is the greater challenge. There is another reason this lesson matters. Modern life often rewards appearances. People can appear successful while privately struggling, appear disciplined while lacking self-control, appear wise while making destructive choices. Social media amplifies this phenomenon. Carefully curated images create the impression that everything is fine. Meanwhile, hidden realities remain unaddressed. Solomon likely experienced something similar. Outwardly, his kingdom flourished. His reputation expanded. His achievements multiplied. Internally, compromise was growing. This contrast reminds us that true success cannot be evaluated solely through external achievements. A person can gain influence while losing integrity, accumulate wealth while sacrificing relationships, build an impressive career while neglecting character. The world may celebrate visible accomplishments, but lasting fulfillment depends upon deeper realities. Alignment, wholeness, integrity, the integration of belief and behavior. Perhaps that is why Solomon's later reflections in Ecclesiastes feel so powerful. After pursuing pleasure, wealth, achievement, and knowledge, he repeatedly emphasized their limitations, not because these things lack value, but because they cannot substitute for meaningful living. Meaning emerges when actions align with values, when choices reflect convictions, when life moves consistently toward what truly matters. Another profound lesson involves the importance of daily choices. People often underestimate ordinary decisions because they seem insignificant. Yet lives are built through repetition. One conversation strengthens a relationship. One act of honesty builds integrity. One choice to forgive preserves connection. Likewise, one compromise weakens boundaries. One neglected responsibility damages trust. One rationalization reduces accountability. Over time, small decisions accumulate. The person someone becomes is rarely the result of a single moment. It is usually the result of repeated choices. Solomon's life demonstrates both sides of this truth. His early choices toward wisdom created extraordinary flourishing. His later compromises created painful consequences. The principle remained constant. Choices shape character. Character shapes destiny. Perhaps the most encouraging aspect of this lesson is that wisdom remains accessible, not because everyone possesses extraordinary intelligence, but because everyone makes choices. People cannot control every circumstance. They cannot predict every outcome. They cannot eliminate every weakness, but they can choose integrity. They can choose humility. They can choose discipline. They can choose faithfulness. Again and again. One decision at a time. This is why Solomon's story ultimately becomes more than a tragedy. It becomes an invitation. An invitation to close the gap between knowledge and action, between conviction and behavior, between understanding truth and embodying it. Because in the end, people are shaped not merely by what they believe, but by what they repeatedly choose. Solomon knew many of the right things. His life reminds us that knowledge alone is not enough. The real question is simpler. Will we live according to what we already know? Will we practice the wisdom we admire? Will we choose integrity when compromise feels easier? Will we align our lives with our deepest values? Because the greatest tragedy is not lacking wisdom. The greatest tragedy is possessing wisdom and failing to live by it. And the greatest opportunity available to every person is not learning more truth. It is becoming the kind of person who practices the truth they already understand. Solomon's life leaves us with this final challenge. Knowing the right thing matters less than choosing to live it. Because wisdom is not proven through knowledge. Wisdom is proven through obedience, through consistency, through action, and ultimately, through the life a person chooses to build one decision at a time.